For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, if you heard American admirals arguing about where Japan would strike next, chances are one man in a basement already knew the answer. He worked in slippers and a bathrobe. He had not slept in days. He smelled terrible, and he was about to save the Pacific Fleet from total annihilation. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He was the codebreaker who saw the future, and Washington absolutely refused to believe him. This is the story of how a high school dropout in a freezing dungeon outthought the most powerful navy in the Pacific, predicted an attack that the experts said was impossible, and then watched as the men he embarrassed destroyed his career in revenge. It is a story of genius, courage, betrayal, and ultimately, vindication. It is the story of how America won the Battle of Midway. In the spring of 1942, the Empire of Japan seemed absolutely unstoppable. In just 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered an empire larger than anything Alexander the Great or Napoleon Bonaparte had ever achieved. They had swept across Southeast Asia with terrifying speed. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress of British power in Asia, had surrendered in humiliation. Hong Kong was gone. The Dutch East Indies were occupied. Burma was collapsing. Japanese armies were threatening India. Japanese submarines were shelling the coast of California. It seemed entirely possible that Japan would win the Pacific War before America could even properly enter it. Against this tide of Japanese conquest stood a battered American fleet, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, desperately trying to slow the enemy advance. And in a basement in Hawaii, a small group of exhausted men worked around the clock to read the enemy's secret messages, searching for any advantage that might turn the tide. Joseph John Rochefort was not born into privilege or power. He came into the world on May 12, 1900, in Dayton, Ohio. The youngest of 7 children in a hard-working Irish-American family, his father was a laborer who struggled to provide for his large household. Money was always scarce. Opportunity seemed impossibly distant for a boy from such humble circumstances. But young Rochefort possessed something that could not be purchased at any price. He had an extraordinary mind for puzzles. As a teenager growing up in Los Angeles, where the family had relocated, he could solve crossword puzzles faster than anyone around him. He played auction bridge, a highly strategic card game, with a precision that astonished opponents twice his age. He saw patterns where others saw only chaos. His mind worked differently, always searching for the hidden structure beneath the surface. In 1918, with America at war against Germany, Rochefort made a decision that would shape his entire destiny. He was still in high school, just 17 years old, too young to enlist, so he did something that revealed his character perfectly. He lied about his age, claiming he had been born in 1898 instead of 1900. He walked into a Navy recruiting station and signed his life away without ever getting his high school diploma. Most young sailors kept their heads down and followed orders without question. Not Rochefort. He had opinions, and he voiced them regardless of the consequences. When he noticed problems, he pointed them out directly, even to senior officers who did not appreciate criticism from an enlisted man. His superiors quickly realized they had someone unusual on their hands, someone whose brilliance could either be channeled productively or would cause endless trouble. After the war ended, Rochefort's intelligence attracted attention. A fellow officer noticed his remarkable gift for puzzles and logical reasoning. He recommended the young sailor for a new and deeply secretive assignment within the Office of Naval Communications. In 1925, at the remarkable age of just 25 years old, Rochefort found himself in Washington, heading the Navy's code-breaking desk. There he learned the intricate art of cryptanalysis from Agnes Meyer Driscoll, a civilian mathematician who was one of the finest code breakers America had ever produced. Driscoll was legendary for her ability to break into seemingly impenetrable cipher systems. She taught Rochefort not just techniques but a philosophy. The enemy always makes mistakes. The codebreaker's job is to find those mistakes and exploit them ruthlessly. Rochefort excelled at the work. He had a natural talent for it, but he also harbored a secret frustration. He did not want to sit in an office all day, hunched over intercepted messages, tracking letter frequencies and code groups. He wanted to go to sea. He wanted to command ships. He wanted adventure. Codebreaking felt like clerical work to him, not the life of action he craved. This tension between what he wanted personally and what the Navy needed from him professionally would define his entire career. In 1929, the Navy made a decision that would prove invaluable. They sent Rochefort to Japan for an extended immersion in Japanese language and culture. For 3 years, he lived in Tokyo with his wife and young son, speaking Japanese daily, reading Japanese newspapers, socializing with Japanese colleagues, absorbing not just vocabulary and grammar, but the subtle ways that Japanese military officers thought and expressed themselves. He learned to understand not just what Japanese communications said, but what they implied, what they assumed, what they left unsaid. He was becoming something extraordinarily rare, a man who could read Japanese minds through their messages, who could fill in blanks that would stump any ordinary translator. This expertise would one day prove worth more than a fleet of battleships. By the late 1930s, war clouds were gathering across the Pacific Ocean. Japan was expanding aggressively into China, committing atrocities that shocked the world. American military planners knew that a confrontation between the two Pacific powers was coming. They needed men who truly understood Japan, who could anticipate Japanese strategy and tactics. They needed Joseph Rochefort. In June of 1941, Commander Joseph Rochefort arrived at Pearl Harbor to take charge of a small cryptanalysis unit that had been operating in the basement of the main administration building. The space was cramped, measuring roughly 50 by 100 feet. It was poorly ventilated. The air conditioning system, designed to protect the sensitive equipment, kept the temperature uncomfortably cold. The men who worked there gave the place a nickname that stuck. They called it the dungeon. This unlikely place, this freezing basement with its concrete floors and humming machines, would become the most important intelligence operation of the entire Pacific War. Rochefort was given 10 officers and about 30 enlisted men. His mission sounded simple, but was actually nearly impossible. He was to intercept Japanese naval radio communications, decrypt them, translate them, and provide intelligence to the Pacific Fleet commander. But there was an enormous problem. The Japanese had recently changed their most important naval code, a fiendishly complex system that American cryptanalysts designated JN-25. JN-25 was a 2-part super-encrypted code, meaning that the Japanese first encoded their messages using a massive codebook, then encrypted those codes a second time using a separate set of additives. Breaking it required reconstructing both the codebook and the additive tables, a task of staggering mathematical complexity. Progress was painfully slow. Rochefort's team could read fragments, hints, shadows of meaning, not nearly enough to provide real warning of Japanese intentions. December 7, 1941, a date that would live in infamy. The Japanese launched their devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Rochefort and his team had detected signs of Japanese aggression in the weeks before. They had noticed the Japanese changing their encryption systems. They had observed Japanese warships changing their radio call signs more frequently than normal, but they had failed to predict that Pearl Harbor itself would be the target. The focus of Japanese attention had seemed to be elsewhere, toward Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. Rochefort stood in the dungeon that terrible Sunday morning, listening to the bombs exploding overhead, watching through the windows as smoke rose over the shattered fleet. Battleship Row was burning. Thousands of American sailors were dying, and he had not seen it coming. The failure carved itself into his soul. It would haunt him for the rest of his life. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander who had been caught so completely off guard, was relieved of duty shortly after the attack. His replacement arrived on Christmas Day, 1941. Admiral Chester Nimitz was a calm and thoughtful Texan, a submarine expert who radiated quiet competence. He inherited a disaster. His fleet was crippled. The Japanese were rampaging across the Pacific, conquering territory with terrifying speed. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had been captured. Singapore was about to surrender. The situation looked absolutely hopeless. Most commanders in such circumstances would have blamed the intelligence failure on Rochefort and his team. They would have cleaned house, brought in new people, made a public show of accountability. Nimitz made a profoundly different choice. He kept Rochefort in place. He told him to keep working. He trusted the man in the dungeon when he had every reason not to. This decision, this leap of faith, would change the course of history. Do you think leaders today give enough support to unconventional thinkers who have failed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed in the dungeon. Rochefort drove his team with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He worked alongside them, often for 20 hours at a stretch, sometimes longer. He slept on a cot in his office when exhaustion finally overwhelmed him. He wore a smoking jacket or bathrobe over his khaki uniform because the basement air conditioning made the space so bitterly cold. He sometimes went days without bathing. His appearance became notorious. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, would later describe Rochefort as one of the most unmilitary-looking officers he had ever encountered. But appearance meant nothing to Rochefort. Only the codes mattered, only finding the truth buried in the enemy's messages. The Japanese Navy was generating vastly more radio traffic now that major offensive operations were underway across the Pacific. More messages meant more material for the cryptanalysts to work with. Slowly, painfully, the codebreakers began making progress against JN-25. By early 1942, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted messages. It was not much, but it was enough to catch glimpses of Japanese planning, enough to begin predicting enemy movements. Rochefort had assembled an extraordinary team of misfits and geniuses. These were not the sort of men who would have thrived in the traditional navy. They were eccentrics, rebels, brilliant minds who did not fit the military mold, and Rochefort had somehow gathered them all in one basement. Thomas Dyer was his chief cryptanalyst, a brilliant mathematician from Pennsylvania with a sardonic sense of humor. Dyer kept a sign on his desk that captured the dungeon's spirit perfectly. It read, "You do not have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." He would work for days on a single problem, filling notebooks with calculations, until suddenly the pattern would emerge from the chaos. Joseph Finnegan was a Japanese linguist of almost uncanny ability. Where other translators needed complete sentences to work with, Finnegan could look at a partial decrypt, just fragments of words and broken phrases, and somehow understand what the original message had said. He could fill in missing characters from context, from his understanding of how Japanese officers thought and wrote. He was not just translating language, he was reading minds. Jasper Holmes was a former submariner who had been forced out of sea duty by health problems. He had a sharp, tactical mind and the ability to translate raw intelligence into operational meaning. When the cryptanalysts produced a decrypt, Holmes could explain what it meant for the fleet, what it implied about enemy movements, what opportunities it created. Wesley Wright was another leading cryptanalyst who worked closely with Dyer. Together they led the mathematical assault on JN-25, searching for patterns in the seemingly random groups of numbers and letters. The dungeon also employed enlisted men who had originally been musicians. After the battleship California was sunk at Pearl Harbor, the surviving members of her band were reassigned to Station Hypo and retrained as operators for the IBM tabulating machines that processed intercepted messages. These former bandsmen became essential to the operation, running punch cards through the machines hour after hour, searching for the patterns that would crack the codes. The culture Rochefort created in the dungeon was unlike anything else in the rigidly hierarchical navy. Rank meant almost nothing. Ideas meant everything. Officers and enlisted men worked side by side without the usual formality. Rochefort never demanded to be addressed as Sir or Commander after every sentence. He did not care about spit-polished shoes or perfectly pressed uniforms. He wanted solutions, not salutes. As Rochefort himself put it, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." It was not just a slogan. It was how the dungeon actually operated. In February and March of 1942, intelligence from the dungeon helped American carriers conduct a series of hit-and-run raids against Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands and Gilbert Islands. The raids were militarily minor, but they demonstrated that the codebreakers were providing real value. Admiral Nimitz was paying close attention. He visited the dungeon regularly, listening to Rochefort's briefings, asking sharp questions. A bond of trust was forming between the fleet commander and the eccentric genius in the basement. Then came April, and everything escalated. On April 18, 16B, 25 medium bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from the carrier Hornet and struck the Japanese home islands. They bombed Tokyo itself. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was absolutely enormous. The Japanese high command was humiliated beyond measure. They had promised the emperor that American bombs would never touch the sacred home islands. Now they had been proven liars. Heads would roll, and new plans would be made. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese combined fleet, saw an opportunity in his nation's rage and shame. Yamamoto was perhaps the most brilliant naval strategist Japan had ever produced. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial power better than almost any other Japanese officer, and he knew that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. Yamamoto had long wanted to draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in a single, decisive battle. Now, in the wake of the Doolittle humiliation, he had the political support to act. He began planning an operation that would lure the Americans into a trap and finish what Pearl Harbor had started. Rochefort's team began intercepting messages about a major Japanese offensive planned for late May or early June of 1942. The messages referred to a target using only a two-letter designation, AF. Rochefort studied the traffic patterns carefully. He analyzed which units were receiving orders. He examined the logistics being assembled, the ships being positioned, the aircraft being concentrated. He became convinced that AF meant Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand sitting about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific, a vital stepping stone that could serve as a base for attacks on Hawaii itself. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor would be directly threatened. The entire American position in the Pacific could collapse. But Washington disagreed, and the disagreement was vicious. The Navy's main code-breaking unit, designated OP-20G, was located in Washington. It had significantly more personnel and more resources than Rochefort's dungeon, and its analysts reached a completely different conclusion about Japanese intentions. They believed the target was elsewhere, perhaps the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, perhaps Port Moresby in New Guinea, perhaps even the American West Coast. Some Washington analysts considered it simply impossible that Japan would commit major forces against an atoll as small and remote as Midway. The disagreement became bitter and personal. Commander John Redman ran OP-20G in Washington. He was a communications officer by background, not a trained cryptanalyst. He had not spent years studying Japanese language and culture as Rochefort had, but he was politically connected. His brother, Joseph Redman, was an influential rear admiral in the Navy's communications hierarchy. The Redman brothers believed that intelligence should flow through proper channels, from Pearl Harbor to Washington, where headquarters staff would interpret it and pass authoritative assessments to the fleet. Rochefort's habit of reporting his analysis directly to Admiral Nimitz, bypassing Washington entirely, infuriated the Redman brothers. In their view, he was undermining the entire system of centralized intelligence control. He was a loose cannon, he was insubordinate, and he needed to be brought to heel. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, sided with his headquarters staff. The assessment from Washington was that Rochefort was wrong. The Japanese were not heading for Midway. The man in the basement was being dismissed by the men in the marble corridors of power. But Rochefort refused to back down. He was absolutely certain of his analysis. He knew these code groups. He understood Japanese operational thinking. He could feel the shape of the coming attack in the pattern of the messages. AF was Midway. The assault would come in late May or early June. And if America was not ready, the consequences would be catastrophic. He needed proof. He needed something that would silence the doubters once and for all. One of his team members, Jasper Holmes, conceived a brilliant deception. What if they could trick the Japanese into confirming the meaning of AF? Holmes proposed that the American garrison on Midway send an unencrypted radio message, a fake emergency report, claiming that the island's water desalination plant had suffered a critical failure. Midway was supposedly running out of fresh drinking water. If the Japanese intercepted this plain language message and then referenced it in their own encrypted communications. If they reported that AF was having water problems, that would prove beyond any doubt that AF meant Midway. Rochefort seized on the idea. He took it to his old friend Edwin Layton, who served as intelligence officer directly to Admiral Nimitz. Rochefort and Layton had known each other since 1929, when they had travelled to Japan together to study the language. They trusted each other completely. Layton presented the deception plan to Nimitz himself. The Admiral approved immediately. A message was sent to Midway via underwater submarine cable, a communication method the Japanese could not intercept. The message instructed the garrison commander to broadcast a fake radio report about the water shortage. Within 48 hours, Japanese naval intelligence transmitted a coded message that was intercepted by American listening stations. The message reported that AF was experiencing fresh water difficulties. The trap had worked flawlessly. AF was Midway. Joseph Rochefort had been right all along. Even then, incredibly, some officers in Washington remained skeptical. They suggested the Japanese might have planted the message deliberately to mislead American intelligence, but Admiral Nimitz had seen enough. He trusted Rochefort. He began preparing his carriers for the decisive battle that was coming. Do you think modern intelligence agencies handle internal disagreements better or worse than they did in 1942? I would love to hear your perspective in the comments. By late May, Rochefort's team was processing an almost unbelievable volume of intercepted traffic. They were decrypting and analyzing between 500 and 1,000 Japanese messages per day. Working around the clock in shifts, fueled by coffee and desperation, they assembled an extraordinarily detailed picture of Japanese plans. They knew Yamamoto would send 4 heavy aircraft carriers, the cream of the Japanese fleet, Akagi, the flagship, Kaga, a converted battleship that was one of the largest carriers in the world, Soryu and Hiryu, fast and deadly. These 4 ships had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had smashed British naval power in the Indian Ocean. They had never been defeated. The codebreakers knew the attack would come around June 4th or 5th. They knew the strength and composition of the invasion force. They knew that the Japanese believed they had achieved complete strategic surprise, that they expected to catch the Americans utterly unprepared. The Americans had only 3 carriers available to defend Midway, Enterprise and Hornet, sailing together as Task Force 16 under Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown, which had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. A Japanese bomb had penetrated deep into the ship and detonated, causing severe damage. Engineers at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard examined Yorktown, and estimated repairs would take at least 3 months. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working around the clock, 1,400 workers swarmed over the wounded carrier, patching holes, restoring systems, getting her ready to fight. It was one of the greatest feats of emergency repair in naval history. Admiral Nimitz faced an agonizing decision that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. He had to commit virtually everything he had, 3 aircraft carriers against 4, based largely on the analysis of a codebreaker working in a basement. 3 carriers were all that stood between Japan and total dominance of the Pacific Ocean. If he sent them to Midway and Rochefort was wrong, if the Japanese were actually heading somewhere else entirely, the American fleet would be hopelessly out of position. Hawaii itself might be left defenseless, open to invasion. The entire Pacific War could be lost in a single catastrophic miscalculation. The pressure on Nimitz was immense. His superiors in Washington were skeptical. His own staff was divided. Some officers urged caution, suggesting he wait for more definitive intelligence before committing his forces. The consequences of being wrong were almost too terrible to contemplate. But Nimitz had spent hours with Rochefort in the dungeon. He had listened to the codebreaker's analysis. He had watched the man's certainty grow as more and more intercepts confirmed the pattern, and Nimitz trusted him. In the end, command decisions come down to trust. You evaluate the evidence, you assess the people providing the analysis, and then you make a choice. Nimitz made the call. He ordered his carriers to take position northeast of Midway, hiding behind a weather front, out of range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. They would wait in ambush. The hunters would become the hunted. Everything depended on Rochefort being right. On the morning of June 3rd, 1942, American patrol planes spotted the Japanese invasion fleet approaching Midway from the southwest. The battle was about to begin. In the dungeon at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort and his team could only wait. They had done everything humanly possible. They had provided the warning. They had identified the target, the timing, the enemy forces. Now it was up to the sailors and pilots to execute. The morning of June 4th dawned clear and beautiful over the Central Pacific. The Japanese carrier strike force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, launched its first wave against Midway at approximately 4:30 in the morning. 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and Zero fighters roared off the flight decks and headed for the American base. The Marines on Midway had been warned. They scrambled every fighter they had, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of newer Wildcats. But the American planes were badly outmatched. Japanese Zeros slaughtered them. 15 of the 26 Marine fighters were shot down. The Japanese bombers struck the airfield, destroying hangars, fuel tanks, and installations. But the runways remained operational, and Nagumo's flight leader radioed back that a second strike would be needed to fully neutralize Midway as a threat. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft, which had been armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against enemy ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for another attack on the island. This decision would prove to be the most catastrophic mistake of the Pacific War. Rearming aircraft was an extraordinarily complex and dangerous process. Heavy bombs and torpedoes had to be lowered from aircraft on the hangar deck and wheeled away. New weapons had to be brought up from the magazines and hoisted into place. Aviation fuel lines had to be connected and disconnected. The process took at least 90 minutes under ideal conditions. The hangar decks of the Japanese carriers became dangerously crowded with ordnance. Bombs and torpedoes that had been removed from aircraft were stacked on dollies, waiting to be returned to the magazines. Aviation gasoline was everywhere. And then, at 7:40 in the morning, came the report that changed everything. A Japanese scout plane, launched late due to mechanical problems, radioed a contact report. American warships had been sighted to the northeast of Midway. 10 ships. Course and speed indicated they were approaching the Japanese fleet. Nagumo was stunned. American carriers were not supposed to be anywhere near Midway. Japanese intelligence had assured him that the American fleet was still in Pearl Harbor. The entire operational plan assumed strategic surprise. Now that assumption was shattered. Nagumo frantically reversed his previous order. The reserve aircraft must be rearmed again, this time with anti-ship weapons. Chaos erupted on the flight decks and in the hangars as crews began the process all over again. Bombs that had just been loaded were being removed. Torpedoes that had just been stowed were being brought back up. The carriers were caught in the worst possible position, committed to neither mission, vulnerable to both. Between 7 and 10 that morning, wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet. Land-based bombers from Midway, 6 Grumman Avenger torpedo planes making their first combat appearance, 4 Army B-26 medium bombers carrying torpedoes. High-altitude B-17 bombers dropped their loads from 20,000 feet. Marine dive bombers and scout bombers made their runs. Almost all were shot down or driven off. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, superb Zero fighters flown by veteran pilots, tore through the American formations with deadly efficiency. Not a single hit was scored on the Japanese carriers. Then came the carrier-based torpedo bombers. Their sacrifice would become one of the most heroic episodes in American naval history. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, was the first to find the Japanese fleet. Waldron had disagreed with his air group commander about the search course. He trusted his own instincts and led his 15 obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers on a separate heading. He found the enemy when others did not. But finding the Japanese was one thing. Attacking them was another matter entirely. The Devastator was a slow, ungainly aircraft, already obsolete when the war began. To drop a torpedo successfully, a pilot had to fly low and straight, at barely 100 knots, holding course while Japanese fighters swarmed around him and anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with steel. It was essentially a suicide mission. Waldron knew it. His men knew it. They attacked anyway. Without fighter escort, without any hope of survival, Torpedo Squadron 8 flew straight at the Japanese carriers. The Zeros fell upon them like wolves on sheep. One by one, the devastators were shot down. Waldron's plane was hit and went into the water. His gunner was killed. Every single aircraft in the squadron was destroyed. Of the 30 men who flew that mission, only one survived. Ensign George Gay was shot down but managed to escape his sinking aircraft. He floated in the ocean for hours, hiding under a seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. They found the Japanese, pressed home their assault, and were slaughtered. 10 of 14 planes were destroyed. None of their torpedoes hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed soon after. The Zeros were waiting. The anti-aircraft guns were ready. 10 of 12 aircraft were lost. Again, no hits. Of the 41 torpedo bombers launched from American carriers that morning, only 6 limped back to their ships. They had scored not a single hit on the enemy. It seemed like a catastrophic failure. It seemed like pointless death. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. Their heroism was not wasted. The relentless attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver continuously, twisting and turning to avoid torpedoes, unable to launch their own strike aircraft. More critically, the Zero fighters were drawn down to wave top level, pursuing the slow torpedo bombers, burning fuel, expending ammunition. When the next American attack came, there would be no fighters waiting at high altitude to intercept it. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise, 2 squadrons that had launched together. He had followed his navigation plot to the expected interception point and found nothing but empty ocean. The Japanese were not where intelligence had predicted. His fuel was running critically low. Several of his pilots would not have enough to make it back to the carrier regardless of what he decided next. McCluskey faced a terrible choice. Turn back toward Enterprise and abort the mission, continue searching, and risk losing his entire air group to fuel exhaustion, or trust his instincts and gamble everything on finding the enemy. McCluskey decided to continue. He turned northwest toward Japan, reasoning that the enemy carriers must have changed course, but could not have gone far. Minutes stretched into agonizing uncertainty. Fuel gauges dropped lower and lower. Then McCluskey spotted something. A single Japanese destroyer racing across the water at high speed, leaving a white wake against the blue Pacific. It was the Arashi, which had been left behind to depth charge an American submarine that had been harassing the Japanese fleet. Now the destroyer was rushing at maximum speed to rejoin its formation. McCluskey turned to follow the destroyer's course. If Arashi was trying to catch up to the carriers, she would lead him straight to them. At 10:20 in the morning, the clouds parted, and McCluskey saw the Japanese fleet spread out below him. 4 carriers, dozens of escorts, and on the flight decks of the carriers, aircraft lined up wing to wing, being armed and fueled for the strike against the American ships. The Japanese were completely exposed. At almost the same moment, by pure coincidence, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived from a different direction. The 2 American formations, approaching at right angles, had achieved something that seemed almost miraculous. They had caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable, with aircraft on deck, ordnance in the hangars, fighters out of position. The gods of war were smiling on America that morning. The dive bombers screamed down from 20,000 feet. Japanese lookouts, scanning the horizon for more torpedo bombers, did not see them until it was far too late. The Zeros, still at low altitude, their fuel tanks nearly empty, their ammunition bins depleted from the morning's killing, could not climb fast enough to intercept. The Japanese carriers lay spread across the ocean below, their yellow flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for the counterstrike against the American fleet. Aviation gasoline hoses snaked across the decks. Bomb hoists were raising weapons from the magazines. Torpedoes were being loaded onto attack planes. It was exactly the kind of target that dive bomber pilots dreamed about. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, began his dive on Kaga along with McCluskey's group. But as he pushed over, he realized something was wrong. Too many aircraft were targeting the same carrier. The attack was becoming bunched, confused. Best pulled out of his dive and looked for another target. There, to the north, steamed another carrier, Nagumo's flagship Akagi. Best reformed with just 2 wingmen and dove on her instead. His 1,000-pound bomb fell true. It penetrated the flight deck just aft of the midships elevator and exploded in the upper hangar. The blast set off a chain reaction among the aircraft and ordnance packed below. Within minutes, Akagi was transformed from the pride of the Japanese Navy into a floating inferno. Kaga absorbed hit after hit from McCluskey's aircraft. One bomb struck near the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of the ship's senior officers instantly. Other bombs tore open the flight deck, igniting fires that could not be controlled. The carrier was doomed. Meanwhile, Yorktown's dive bombers had found Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 aircraft against her. 3 direct hits smashed into the carrier within 30 seconds. Soryu's captain later described watching helplessly as his ship died. Flames consuming everything, ammunition cooking off in tremendous explosions, men burning or leaping into the sea. The attack had lasted approximately 5 minutes from first bomb to last. In that brief span of time, the course of the Pacific War was changed forever. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded, burning from bow to stern, their crews desperately fighting fires that could not be controlled. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor, was being destroyed before Yamamoto's eyes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial attack. She was steaming hard to the north, separated from her burning sisters. Her commander, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, ordered an immediate counterstrike. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared off Hiryu's deck, seeking revenge. They found Yorktown. Japanese bombs tore into the American carrier, starting fires, knocking out her boilers. Yorktown went dead in the water, listing badly. Her crew fought the damage with desperate courage. They got the fires under control. They restored power. They got the ship moving again. Then, Hiryu struck a second time. 10 torpedo bombers, guided by a scout plane that had shadowed the wounded Yorktown, launched their deadly weapons at close range. 2 torpedoes smashed into the carrier's hull. The damage was catastrophic. Yorktown went dead again, this time for good. Her captain ordered abandon ship, but Hiryu's survival would be brief. American scout planes found her that afternoon. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, including survivors of the morning attacks and orphaned aircraft from the crippled Yorktown, dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs hit home. Hiryu joined her sisters in destruction. As night fell over the central Pacific, all 4 Japanese carriers were either sunk or sinking. Admiral Yamamoto, watching from his flagship battleship, far behind the action, refused to accept defeat. He ordered his surface ships to push forward, hoping to catch the American carriers in a night battle where Japanese superiority in surface gunnery and torpedo tactics might turn the tide. But Admiral Spruance, commanding the American carriers, refused to take the bait. He withdrew eastward, putting distance between his precious flat-tops and the Japanese battleships. He would not risk what he had won for a chance at destroying more enemy ships. The American strategic goal had been achieved. The Japanese carrier force was annihilated. On June 5th, Yamamoto finally acknowledged reality. He ordered a general withdrawal. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan lost 4 fleet aircraft carriers, the largest and most capable ships in their navy. They lost a heavy cruiser. They lost 248 aircraft. Most devastating of all, they lost over 3,000 men, including more than 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircrew. These were the men who had trained for years, who had executed Pearl Harbor and conquered the Pacific. They could not be replaced. The pilot training programs that had produced them took years to complete. The United States lost 1 aircraft carrier, Yorktown, which actually survived the battle only to be torpedoed by a Japanese submarine 2 days later. They lost a destroyer. They lost 150 aircraft and 307 men. It was a heavy price, but a tiny fraction of Japanese losses. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Never again would Japan launch a major offensive operation. The empire that had seemed absolutely invincible just 6 months earlier was now permanently on the defensive. The initiative had passed to America. The long road to Tokyo had begun. The strategic consequences of Midway cannot be overstated. Japan had lost not only 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, but the core of its naval aviation capability. The pilots and aircrew who died at Midway represented years of intensive training. Japan's pilot training programs were rigorous and slow, producing only a few hundred fully qualified carrier aviators per year. The loss of over 100 experienced combat pilots in a single day crippled Japanese carrier aviation for the remainder of the war. American industrial power was just beginning to mobilize. By the end of 1942, no new Japanese carriers would be ready for action, but America would commission dozens of new carriers, new battleships, new cruisers, new destroyers. The industrial tide was turning irrevocably against Japan. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. That was why he had gambled everything on destroying American carrier power before it could grow. And he had failed. The Japanese government initially concealed the extent of the disaster from its own people. Wounded sailors returning from Midway were isolated in special hospitals, forbidden to contact their families. Survivors were dispersed to distant postings where they could not share what they had witnessed. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a victory, that American losses far exceeded their own. The truth would not emerge until after the war. For the Americans, Midway was a transformation. 6 months earlier, they had been reeling from Pearl Harbor, desperate and outmatched. Now they had proven they could defeat the Japanese at their own game. Confidence surged through the Pacific Fleet. Planning began immediately for offensive operations. Within 2 months, American Marines would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the long island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring the war to Japan's doorstep. In the basement at Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort finally slept. His analysis had been proven correct in the most dramatic way imaginable. His team had provided the intelligence that made victory possible. The dungeon rats, as they called themselves, had changed history. Admiral Nimitz understood exactly what Rochefort had accomplished. Immediately after the battle, he submitted a recommendation that Rochefort receive the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest honors the Navy could bestow for non-combat achievement. The recommendation went to Washington for approval. It was rejected. Admiral Ernest King, who had sided with Washington's analysts before the battle, who had believed that Rochefort was wrong about Midway, refused to approve the award. His chief of staff argued that the intelligence work done by OP-20G in Washington had been of equal value to that done by Station Hypo in Hawaii. This was demonstrably false. Washington had been wrong, Rochefort had been right, but the official position was that credit should be shared. Some historians believe King had a personal dislike for Rochefort, finding his unmilitary appearance and unconventional methods offensive to proper Navy standards. The man who wore a bathrobe and slippers in the dungeon, who went days without bathing, who called senior officers clowns and stuffed shirts, did not fit the image of what a Navy officer should be. The Redmond brothers had not forgotten Rochefort's insubordination either. In their view, he had broken the sacred chain of command by reporting directly to Nimitz instead of sending raw intelligence to Washington for proper interpretation. He had made them look foolish. He had embarrassed the entire headquarters establishment. They set about destroying him. Commander John Redmond complained formally to Admiral King about the operation of Station Hypo. He argued that Rochefort was uncooperative, that he refused to follow proper procedures, that centralized control of naval intelligence required his removal. In November of 1942, just 5 months after the greatest American naval victory of the war, Joseph Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo. He was reassigned to supervise the construction of a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The codebreaker who had helped save the Pacific Fleet was now overseeing ship repairs on the West Coast. He would never return to intelligence work. Rochefort's colleagues were outraged by what they recognized as a vindictive punishment disguised as a routine reassignment. They believed he had been sacrificed to protect the reputations of men who had been catastrophically wrong. But the Navy closed ranks. The true story of Midway's intelligence triumph remained classified for decades. The public never knew what had been done to the man who made victory possible. Rochefort served out the remainder of the war in relative obscurity. He led the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Group in Washington for a time, doing planning work for the eventual invasion of Japan. He rose to the rank of captain, but the brilliance that had burned so intensely in the dungeon was never fully utilized again. The Navy had broken something in him, or perhaps they had simply wasted him. After the war ended, Rochefort remained in the Navy until 1953, when he retired. He returned to college, studied business, and pursued various ventures. He rarely spoke publicly about Midway or his role in the battle. When asked about the medal he had never received, Rochefort was characteristically philosophical. He told colleagues that pursuing the award would only make trouble. He seemed to accept, with a certain weary resignation, that the Navy had its ways, and fighting against institutional politics was ultimately pointless. He had done his duty. History would sort out the rest, but others refused to let the injustice stand. In the decades after the war, Rochefort's former colleagues from the dungeon waged a quiet campaign to get him the recognition he deserved. Admiral Donald Showers, who had served under Rochefort at Station Hypo as a young officer, led the effort with determined persistence. Year after year, they petitioned the Navy to reconsider, to right an old wrong, to honor a man who had been shamefully treated. In 1976, the film Midway was released to wide audiences. Hal Holbrook portrayed Joseph Rochefort, bringing the codebreaker's story to public attention for the first time. Millions of moviegoers learned about the eccentric genius in the basement who had predicted the Japanese attack. 1 month after the film premiered, on July 20th, 1976, Joseph Rochefort died at the age of 76. He never received his medal. He never saw his reputation fully restored. He went to his grave knowing that the Navy he had served so brilliantly had rewarded him with exile and obscurity. But the campaign for justice continued even after his death. Finally, in 1986, 10 years after Rochefort passed away, the Navy presented the Distinguished Service Medal that Admiral Nimitz had recommended 44 years earlier. President Ronald Reagan awarded the medal posthumously at a White House ceremony. Rochefort's daughter and son accepted it on their father's behalf, vindication that came far too late for the man himself, but mattered deeply to those who had served with him. In the year 2000, Joseph Rochefort was inducted into the National Security Agency's Hall of Honor, recognizing his foundational contributions to American signals intelligence. In 2012, a building at Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam was named in his honor. The Captain Joseph J. Rochefort Building stands where the dungeon once operated, a permanent reminder of what happened there. Today, the legacy of Station Hypo shapes how military intelligence is gathered and used around the world. Rochefort pioneered the concept of providing actionable intelligence directly to operational commanders, cutting through bureaucracy to give decision-makers what they needed when they needed it. Every signals intelligence unit that followed has built upon that foundation. The modern American intelligence community owes more to the man in the bathrobe than most people will ever know. Rochefort's story is not simply about code-breaking or military intelligence. It is about the courage required to trust your own analysis when powerful people insist you are wrong. It is about the importance of building teams that value ideas over rank and results over protocol. It is about the tragic reality that institutional politics can destroy those who serve with brilliance and dedication. Joseph Rochefort was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He never fired a weapon in combat. He never commanded a ship in battle, but the intelligence he provided allowed American pilots and sailors to be in exactly the right place, at precisely the right time. His work in that freezing basement transformed what should have been a Japanese triumph into the most decisive American naval victory of the 20th century. The Battle of Midway lasted 4 days, but the decisions that shaped its outcome were made in the weeks and months before, in a cramped underground space, where an exhausted man in a bathrobe refused to stop working until he found the truth hidden in the enemy's messages. Admiral Nimitz, who trusted Rochefort when Washington would not, summarized the codebreaker's contribution in words that have echoed through history. He said that Rochefort's decision to continue analyzing the traffic and his judgment about where the enemy would be found decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. Joseph Rochefort did not seek glory. He did not care about medals or public recognition. He cared about getting the answer right. He cared about giving his commander the information needed to win, and when the bureaucrats punished him for being correct, he accepted it without public complaint, because fighting back would have distracted from the work that still needed to be done. In the end, history vindicated him, even if that vindication came decades too late. The dungeon rats who served alongside him knew the truth from the beginning. They had watched a genius at work. They had participated in changing the course of a war, and they spent the rest of their lives making sure the world would eventually understand what their commander had accomplished. Joseph Rochefort lies in rest now, his battles long finished. But his legacy endures in every intelligence analyst who speaks truth to power, in every commander who trusts the expert over the bureaucrat, in every victory won because someone had the courage to see what others could not. The lessons of his life extend far beyond military intelligence. In every organization, in every field, there are people like Rochefort, brilliant individuals who do not fit the mold, who refuse to follow proper channels, who insist on speaking uncomfortable truths. How we treat such people says everything about whether our institutions can adapt and thrive, or whether they will be strangled by their own bureaucracy. The Navy had a choice in 1942. They could have celebrated Rochefort's achievement, learned from his methods, promoted his approach to intelligence analysis. Instead, they punished him for embarrassing the wrong people. They chose institutional pride over operational excellence. They wasted one of the finest minds in the service. History offers its own verdicts. The Redman brothers are remembered, if they are remembered at all, as the men who persecuted a hero. Admiral King's resistance to recognizing Rochefort looks petty and vindictive in retrospect. The dungeon rats became legends, and Joseph Rochefort, the high school dropout who outthought the Japanese Navy, is finally honored as he should have been all along. They dismissed his warning. They said he was wrong about Midway. They punished him for being right. And then, in 5 minutes of diving aircraft and exploding carriers, the truth became undeniable. Be thorough. Be accurate. Trust your analysis. Even when the powerful dismiss your warning, keep working until the truth cannot be denied. That was the lesson of Joseph Rochefort. That was the lesson of the dungeon. That was the lesson of Midway.